Thanks very much for the intro, Yasmina. Naturally, O'Reilly's hosting this presentation because I wrote a book for them, and you noticed if you're watching on Twitter that they've even got a deal to buy it, which is great. We like that. But also, I went ahead and agreed to do this series because I felt I had a little more to say. While writing it, I essentially raised more questions than I felt I answered, despite the almost 600 pages of the book. While it's really a pattern book, I'm not entirely comfortable with purely pattern-centric design methodology, such that I actually wrote a little on this very topic in the introduction for the book. So first, a little overview of that stuff. There are many, many online pattern libraries, which I'm sure many of you have encountered. A lot of them are just showcases of shiny design, as I derisively call it. But patterns have a lot more going for them. And you have to understand those features to understand how to use them. As I see it, patterns are universal and apply equally to a broad range of interfaces. Mobile patterns are surprisingly similar to even desktop patterns and overlap massively with kiosks, TVs, tablets, game consoles, and so forth. Patterns are generalized, and specific implementations are not useful as examples all the time. Their specifics are not the same as yours. You need to understand what is part of the pattern and what is not. Patterns are organized. Very often, there are multiple choices or options for a particular solution. Without good structure, indexing, and cross-referencing, you won't know what the options to choose from are. Patterns should be explained. Just like when you're writing good design specifications, a picture isn't enough. You need to know what the pattern does and why it does this. You need to be able to find the reasons, rooted in cognitive psychology or human physiology, behind each one. Without the reasoning, deciding whether it's successful or not is just a guess. And patterns are best practices. Sometimes it's a little tricky, but very simply, they're not just common practice. Don't assume something popular or trendy is a good idea until you can prove that it is. And patterns are also misunderstood. Obviously, this is not a key attribute of patterns we want them to have, but it's true. Patterns are misunderstood, and therefore, in a lot of design sessions or exercises or projects, they're misused. The design solutions are reactionary because they solve for a single point problem instead of considering the whole system. Even when larger solutions are found, they're single view, by which I mean they're only for one screen, one device, or one platform. When seeking these solutions, the first satisfactory solution tends to be accepted and then becomes entrenched, so you can't consider other solutions. There should always be incentives to keep working to find not the first acceptable, but the best possible solution. There's likewise no incentive to find unique, interesting, or differentiable solutions. The rote solution, as I call it, or the published pattern, or whatever the best-known example does on your favorite iPhone app, for example, is used without modification, which is another reason I often don't like to give examples in my pattern libraries. Patterns that do consider solutions generally lead to excessively high-level design with no reasoning or an incomprehensible one. If you give all this to your visual designers to make the final comps or developers to build it, they won't necessarily understand what part is important, so may modify it to meet their specific implementation needs and miss the point, breaking the pattern. I tend to derisively call all this the heuristic solution. It's not bad per se, and in fact the reason we've been getting away with it for years, and I admit I got away with it for years before I figured this out and came up with these solutions, is that it checks all the boxes, but it's not inspired and never truly satisfactory. Now, by satisfactory, I mean that very explicitly. I mean that if you are measuring the success of your product, it will pass those customer satisfaction measures. If you have 4C come in and measure your site or doing it yourself, you can get improvement by pursuing design in this way, but it will level off. You're never going to get that top tier of stuff without luck or general random inspiration. You can't regularly repeat that, no matter what you do. let me try a simple example on for size to make it a little bit clearer. Very regularly in discussions on various design forums, or I've seen this on LinkedIn groups, for example, someone will ask for input on a solution. Often these are hard to do because they're too fuzzy because of IP problems, but if somebody brings up something clear enough they can be discussed, a lot of the responses offer up the best practices, by which they mean common practices. For example, a couple weeks ago, and quite regularly really, there was a question, and not this one, this is an example drawing of my own for, again, intellectual property purposes, but it was this gist. A question involving giving users 3 options, and what's the default, and how do you label it, and how do they submit, and so forth. Pretty much every response is, no, definitely not a pull down, but users understand radio buttons, and why would you do anything but best practice? And I sit and look at it a little more seriously here. The radio button solution seems pretty reasonable. We all understand that, right? But you look at it, and there's 2 clicks for only one real action. You select an option, then you have to press the save button. And then we dive deeper, and we find out actual end users, don't understand the difference between radio buttons and checkboxes as clearly as we understand it as designers or other practitioners. We're told explicitly that there's multi-select for check and single select for radio, but end users don't get the gist of that. Doesn't mean you can violate it, but it doesn't mean that it means that they don't have an innate understanding, so it's not as obvious as an answer. Research also shows us that understandings of details like this, even the basic action of click the radio button, then click save, tend to go out the window when people change contexts. No one understands form elements, even if they understand them on a desktop, for example, when they're on a kiosk. So it suddenly becomes hard to call this a best practice, absolutely unequivocally best practice, without those answers. So what else should you do here? A simple answer for me, with a bunch of this mobile crazy experience, is to provide the buttons directly.
Excuse me, Stephen. Hi,
Sorry.
folks. Sorry to interrupt here. We're getting some reports from folks that they're having a little bit of difficulty hearing you because the mic is just a tad bit too close. Can you just move it just a tiny bit, and we'll see if that improves? Back to you.
Oh, yeah, it did once. Is this any better?
I think that will work a bit. I'll let you know if we need to adjust it a little bit more. Back to you.
So, this one was simple answer for me is to provide them as buttons. One-click action instead of selection, and then submit selection. But I have to admit, this example is mine, an actual product I made. I went with the radio buttons, went ahead and let people spend an extra click submitting the selection, have the problems with the possibility of indication being different from selection, all for consistency and ease of implementation, because I had multiple screens of this. But I now think that I misstepped and did the wrong choice because it was simply a settings page, and who cares, and I didn't put that much effort into it. But these are important for reasons I don't need to get into. This was important, and I should have put more thought into this thing. So even the last year, need to improve this. And for your designs, especially in key important screens and landing pages and the core parts of your application, to move from acceptable to exceptional, you need to provide yourself and your organization an atmosphere in which new ideas can be discovered and fostered. So that was just one very simple example. If you find yourself or your team reaching out to simply copy simple standard implementations into your designs or copy existing well-known products, stop and think about it. It's not necessarily wrong, but you need to actually be explicit and know what you're doing with this. Do you want your product to look like everyone else's, as these many screens do? Isn't differentiation one of the key attributes you're trying to pursue? that we read about in business magazines. It's possibly even on your business plan. You're going to differentiate with great UI. But it's hard to do that if you're copying everybody else's best practice. And how do you know? The key problem is, how do you know it's the right solution for your situation and your users? They're different and they use their product in a different way. It may be good, not saying discount it, but you have to know and you have to be able to prove it before you can do that. The most important thing by far is to be aware, therefore, of what you're doing. At any step, be able to explain to yourself, to your team, and to your bosses what you're doing and why. As I like to say, be a conscious designer. This can also help to get rid of disagreements because there's less opinion. You don't bring yours to the table, and your insistence on proof can help guide the discussions to sharing and collaboration. If you can do that, it's hard to go wrong, really, with any design decision. So I have here a series of design principles you can follow, some tactics to make it a little bit easier. You don't just have to take that philosophy and go with it, and then we'll talk about specifics. First up, make sure you understand the problem. Before you design anything, ask questions. Perform user interviews, ask the business what they want, and gather any other information about the current or expected usage that you can. Develop measurable objectives, stick to them during design, and be sure to measure after it launches. Without feedback, you can't learn. Just the other day, Bill Scott, and if you don't know, he's a rather well-known UX guy from Netflix, authored a bunch of the Yahoo pattern library, and he's just moved to PayPal in the last couple months. So he was interviewed the other day, and I thought this said it perfectly about his new job at PayPal. Quote, I interviewed over 100 different people in the organization in my first 6 to 8 weeks. My theory was that the smarts was already in the organization. My interviews confirmed this. In many ways, my job is collecting the intelligence, distilling it, and connecting the right people and information together, and ensuring that we remove friction in decision and instead multiply the ability of our makers to make. I've had identical experiences a lot of places. I just like how he said it better. The key thing here is try not to draw. This is hard for me to do, and it was one of my key revelations some years ago when I started realizing I was doing some of this stuff wrong and not getting wonderful, wonderful designs always. But sketching concepts too early will tend to lock you and everybody else on the team into that thinking. You might be on the wrong track. So keep away from this and seek to understand the problem space first. And for more examples, if you're wondering what this picture is, this is one I did for Hallmark, where one of the first things we did with such a totally new experience, a new industry we're working in, was have them up to the design office for 2 full days of interviews and data gathering. And here we kicked off with a visit to a store, an actual live store. They have lots of test zones, but a plain old live store to really understand their current processes, needs, and gaps. Once the discussion is over, write down what you came up with. This also might seem a little dumb, and of course you write it down, but I mean make clear, simple documents like problem statements, product visions, value statements, design objectives, design principles, or design goals. Not all of those. Pick the ones that best meet your needs. Once everyone has agreed to them, and I mean explicitly agreed to them with input and discussion to get that agreement, not just tacit agreement, everybody nods their head when you give a presentation, I print them out and put them on the wall. You may have seen personas go up all over the working area, so everyone can refer to them. Well, I like to print these sorts of documents nice and big and stick them on the wall of the team room, which is here, and those are epics for an agile process to their right, or as smaller things over each pod if that's the way you're laid out, so that every designer, product owner, or even development team can refer to them anytime. Speaking of teams, the best ideas come from individuals or small teams working independently. But to get the most unique, good ideas, task those individuals or small teams to develop quick independent designs and then regularly share and regroup over and over again, iterating to a final solution. Though I'm not explicitly talking about that today, you might find a lot of this, it starts sounding similar to certain trendy development processes like Agile, which are iterative or incremental. That's true. These can mesh very nicely into that. And if you look up some of my other presentations, you'll see discussions of that, or you can ask questions further. Manage your teams to make sure they work well together, by which I mean all the individuals on the team work well together, and they keep working as a team, not just as a bunch of individuals trying to then hash out their design. A number of these design processes I like to use are what I call studio methods, as I learned to apply them in design school studio classes. These always threw together groups of students to come up with a single solution. Which method works depends on you, your team, the project, the environment you work in, and so forth. There are many of these, and you might go ahead and ask, say, designers on your team for their favorite ways of working or investigate others, but here's a few that are to get you started and at least thinking about it. 100 thumbnails is kind of a shorthand for a visual sort of brainstorming, usually by yourself. It's about stretching your limits by forcing a slightly impossible number of variations. It doesn't have to be 100. If you have 3 ideas already sitting there and can't think of a fourth, instead insist that you make 10 more. Even if they're crazy and stupid, they get your brain working, and one may be brilliant or lead to a brilliant idea. Mood boards, or things like them, pick out not so much good ideas as good thoughts and principles, generally from non-competitive industries. You pick advertising or other non-interactive media, print them out if they inspire you, and stick them on the wall. You can even do this in a fairly formal way and have an inspiration area on the same team room wall. Like everything, it's nice sometimes to say why it's inspiring, but you don't have to do it very formally. You can just take a Sharpie marker to it and circle the part you like and put a smiley face. Speaking of Sharpies, sketch things, draw things, all the time. I put sketch down here because drawing to a lot of people means formal drawings. Sketch means quick and dirty and thinking while drawing. Get your ideas down rapidly when you think about them. As soon as it gets to the time to draw, start putting things on paper or whiteboards or digitally. Modeling is sort of the 3D version of a sketch. For mobiles, this can actually be key because of the context of use. Even if you aren't building hardware, tape paper designs to old handsets or blocks of wood. Carry them around and wave them at each other. This matters, figuring out how people are going to use things in their real life and in their hands as opposed to pieces of paper on a table. Co-design, which is a version of which is up on the screen here, is to at least occasionally bring everyone together and put up paper or give them whiteboard markers. It isn't just sharing existing designs, but to actually have everybody design in the room at the same time with each other. And during this, especially, talk aloud. Remember when I said you should be able to explain your reasoning? The next step, when you're comfortable with that, is to be able to explain what you're drawing at the same time. You need to add buttons so the user can select options because they are easy to read and easy to use, and so forth. You, as a conscious designer, know why you're drawing what you're drawing. And so you don't just draw the box, but you explain, what if we did the following? Some of my favorite design tools are not digital, but very physical. Scissors and tape are probably the ones that I would pick the most. Perhaps Post-it notes first, though. But scissors and tape are great because you can cut apart printouts of your designs or existing designs or competitors' sites or whatever and tape them back together in interesting ways, especially as a team exercise. A little more on this next. And similar to the modeling, gesture and act. Even if you're not in the right environment, like in a store, even if the device is a tape dispenser instead of a phone, acting out actions can help explain or help you understand the end user a little bit better. Many of these processes involve individuals working independently. As I already said, everyone comes back together with ideas and you review them as a group. Then I encourage you to not evaluate and up-select or down-select complete designs of one or sort of the other, but evaluate each component. How does each and every individual element on the design fit into the overall concepts? Reassign work on the components that are similar to other components and other designs so they're combined in interesting ways and people get outside their comfort zones. When working with design concepts, whether you're evaluating competitor sites or with the design teams above, remember to approach the design from a modular point of view and evaluate the suitability of each element to the overall goals and process. Even with one idea, whether just trying to determine the idea is good yourself, doing an evaluation, or so forth, don't fall in love with ideas so much that you look at it as a whole or miss the flaws. Don't just look at it and decide it's beautiful and therefore solve the solution, but deconstruct it to figure out what it is, what it's made out of, what patterns, components went into it. And not just then my obvious answer I've been repeating over and over today of why it works, figure out how it might not work. What kind of failures might occur if you do implement it? How does it miss? Deconstructing this means feel free to break out the scissors and tape or erase and scribble and draw lots of arrows on the whiteboard. This can be a little bit of a challenge because we like winners and losers. We like taking 3 complete design sets in and going, design B is the one we want. But stretch yourself and you might be surprised how good the outcome can be. I'm going to go ahead and answer one question I just got to make sure because I didn't preface, one of the things I didn't preface my talk with was what I'm talking about. Everything I talk about here is quite generic and open-ended. It isn't just apps. It isn't or web. It's entire customer experiences. So a lot of the designs, and in fact, if you read the book, we have a little bit about this at the intro, a lot of the patterns are generic. They work on every platform, every interface, everything that you might encounter. Much of this process actually even works for desktop or emails or anything else you're designing. Though I tend to have a mobile bent to it now, it works. These are somewhat universal tools. But to make that clearer, here's a mobile phone on the screen again. So I've already sort of said this when I tell you to not clone screenshots, but it can go a little bit deeper. Your competitors and your forefathers at your company do not have a magic formula. Some have better cultures of design, indeed, which you can strive for, like we're doing today. Some just lucked into it. Sometimes it's engineering prowess or something else. When you're required to look at the competition or the great previous generation ideas, recognize that business models, customers, and goals will not be the same in this part of the world or in this day and age. Inspiration is fine. In fact, inspiration is to be encouraged. But use good processes to find the right answer. What you're looking at up here is, of course, the Walkman phone I'm sure everyone carries in your pocket because everybody wants a music phone. Of course, none of you actually have one of those. That's ridiculous. But go back and look at the news, the tech news years ago. For years after the iPod came out, every pundit was absolutely sure Sony would come and crush the market because of their incredible success with the tape player era. After phones started integrating music, they were sure there was going to be a Walkman music phone. And there eventually was, but as you see here, here's one of them. It didn't happen because Sony apparently, we don't know for sure, but apparently builds good products, but not good ecosystems. They were not able to turn their tape player devices into the digital music era by simply slapping pretty colors and their logo on the thing. It takes a lot more to make products work in this world. Another one of the troublemaker, argumentative phrases I like to say is, brainstorming is for suckers. As we learned it in grade school, brainstorming doesn't work. Brainstorming boosters I've worked with insist it does. The counter studies that say it doesn't work aren't doing it right, to which I say, no one does it right, such that I avoid calling it brainstorming. There are, just like there are stupid questions, as we all know, there are bad ideas. There are ideas you shouldn't even consider because they're out of scope. You don't dismiss them out of hand per se, but you can dismiss things because they're not something that you're trying to talk about today. You need to set preconditions and embrace your constraints. Whether in concepting exercises, workshops, or as individual designers, restrict yourself to only working within the domain, set preconditions, and remind everyone that the goals and objectives define the desired end state. However, I have to warn you, the constraints need to be well defined. They should be written down somewhere early on while you're working on those design objectives and principles and values I talked about earlier. Sometimes there are a lot of them. In this drawing, for example, and this is just a part of the whiteboard, there's a chart of desired features by persona, which was used to set the scope. And then after a couple additional weeks of research and analysis to boil it down, we were able to get to design solutions for these problems. This is a somewhat extreme case where we were able to do a lot of research, but regardless, simple, arbitrary, or improper constraints won't help much, and you might indeed get back to the key point of brainstorming and miss the great ideas. Collaboration is another one that can go on and on. We could talk about for hours. I have an essay on collaboration up on my blog, so if this is a summary. If collaboration eludes you, or like I have been, you get blamed for not being collaborative and need to explicitly think about it, check that out, or others. There are those who write about these kind of things for business journals and so forth. But these days, now that I've thought about it, especially, when I'm asked how I work with others, I absolutely gush at how much I like to collaborate. I can do a lot of tasks. I've been a DBA and all the way through being a graphic designer. I won awards for things like that. I'm great. But I absolutely do not wish to do everything in most jobs. If someone is better at a certain part of it, if there is a graphic designer whose style is exactly what the client needs, then I will do no more than ask and guide and suggest things for that guy. But I certainly won't do the design myself because he can do it better. This is true for everything, in every industry, for all your products. Design teams will ideally have a variety of individuals with a variety of skill sets, or at least, even if you're all the same, you're not identical people who are cloned and raised by the same family. Use the individual skills of team members to find solutions and explore concepts. Some other key attributes of good collaboration have already been outlined above with some of the design principles that you can work through. Be a conscious designer so you can discuss your ideas or defend them. Not because you like it. Defend only what you know to be true from experience. Remember, as you get used to this, much of it becomes second nature. Collaboration can become very informal. When you get into it, you'll start asking advice for even simple behaviors and problems. This sort of activity is why some people like open plan offices. Just turn around and ask the team. Or, as you're walking by somebody's desk, start pointing at an interesting thing they're working on, and a discussion starts, as it did here with a couple of our interns. Beyond collaboration, which is about your team itself, seek to get input from people outside the design team. This is especially a big deal for large organizations that have been around for decades or centuries. Not everyone, no one individual has all the knowledge of the arbitrarily complex systems we work on all the time. So cross-functional collaboration can have great value in confirming concepts, getting input on the viability of concepts, and discovering tangential solutions already considered or in progress somewhere else inside the organization. This is not just useful for the gathering of information, which you should do up front, but to confirm that your design works. Often these same people can add more value after they start seeing what you mean, once you've gotten a few steps into the design process. Oh, you're using that information. Have you talked to these other guys about their project in the stores? And you can start cross-working and make things more efficient. These people can be hard to get a hold of, so use your contacts and do whatever it takes to get them there. If you have to, feed them. Though I've put this here as one step at the end, ideally you're doing this all along. As I discussed earlier, this should be an iterative process, much like many development processes we're all becoming familiar with. At each step along the way, you should be referring back to the design principles, design objectives, project goals, personas, and whatever else you've determined and set at the beginning of the effort. Each working team, or as shown here, the team room where everyone lives, has key documents up on the wall for easy reference. And it falls back to some of the studio methods. When you come up with a solution, don't just explain it as part of the IA or the system, but how it fits into these principles. Say you have an objective of trust and have two design options on the table for a collaboration sharing function on your site. They meet all other objectives of ease of use and so forth broadly equally. The one that can more clearly be said to engender trust wins every time then. On the other hand, maybe your solution is brilliantly beautiful, but violates the objective that you defined earlier of no pop-ups. Always be open to reevaluating the objectives and principles. These principles are essentially, functionally, a hypothesis, and you haven't proven it yet until you've launched it and thrown it in front of customers and so forth. Be open to considering other solutions. This is not to say you can just ignore the objectives or other constraints or for other parts of the project. You must always be conscious and deliberate. If you change an objective, it's just like creating it from scratch. Everyone has to buy into that change and sign off again. And then you need to go back and evaluate the whole project for impacts of this change. Changing your point of view like this can result in the best work you've done. And for me, it's one of the reasons I'm sure this works well, as I've gone through and completely redone a design 3 or 4 times for this exact reason, that we're going through, realize an error, fix it. And it can come up with some of the best work you've done, but it's not trivial to do. If you're designing products for end users, then at some point you want to make sure you get their feedback. Real user data is key to this, so at some point you need to gather it. Before I get to actual user research, I want to mention that all data is good. I always consider user research or user information to include analytics, customer satisfaction numbers, of course lab studies, marketing research, though I'm leery of that, call center rates and other types of complaints, and site feedback. I'm sure I've forgotten one, it seems like I did, but any data about the actual way the thing is used is good. Yes, you have to be careful with some of the data. For example, I'm always leery of market research because of the way it's gathered, and often you don't know how it was gathered, so that's a little tricky. Site feedback. You can find an inflammatory comment that will get blown up out of proportion when it was only one person. But if you work with them all together, you can start getting interesting synergies out of the information. Or take a piece of data from your analytics that was hard to understand and then use site feedback to understand why people are doing it. When designing, you need to figure out how you get past evaluative techniques internally, heuristic evaluations and so forth, to make sure it's something people want to use. You show it to them. So I don't want to get super deep into research because it's a huge field and there are many experts and many other good presentations on the topic. So please go look up some of those if you actually need to run your own research or specify it. But one thing I run into a lot is people tend to be only familiar with research taking lots of money or time. And I've gotten lots of very good results with cheap research in just a few days. So a couple of quick examples of this so you understand the values of them. Paper prototypes, like are shown here, are where you draw the design up on paper or digitally draw it or whatever and make it act like a real live product. This one that you're looking at there's a phone with a hole cut out of the middle of the phone piece of paper, and we put the designs behind it. In general, there's a moderator like it's normal lab research, and then another person acts as what we call the computer and moves little pieces of paper around and so forth. Therefore, you don't have to spend the time building digital products or much less building a real site. You can do this really quickly, and mostly, since it can be hand-drawn or hand-modified, it can iterate rapidly. You can do 2 people through it one day, and one morning, and in the afternoon have revisions to it based on the research. You can do similar results with other quick and dirty prototypes. If you need to test the interactivity of something, that requires it moving around or fading out or something, or being a drag and drop thing, build it in whatever tool you're comfortable with that can work, and you can similarly throw it in front of people. By throw it in front of people, I mean whoever you can get your hands on. It can be difficult or expensive to recruit, and especially if the product is very secret, sometimes there can be people can be in your company maybe leery of showing it. So use friends and family or coworkers, but not, of course, people who've worked on the project so have an opinion on it yet. Put up a poster or a note on the corporate internet and let people come to the cafeteria to give feedback on the new product or run them through a test. It can be just like a big lab test thing, but whoever shows up, and you use their data. Remember, people use products in specific environments. A call center worker uses a boring old desktop computer in a very different environment and manner than you do use your desktop at home. This is called ethnography. You go sit and watch how people work in real live environments, but it's wildly expensive and complex and difficult and fraught with problems of various sorts, though it's very interesting. You can even do that relatively cheaper and quicker by letting people track their daily use for you or try out some version of the product, even if you can only make it work for one user at a time. Let them take photos or videos or write a diary that they turn into you after a week or a month about how they use the product or how they would use it or how their current solution does or does not work for them. And then this feedback all becomes as valid as anything else you've gotten before from internally the team. Whenever you get more valid input, reconsider the entire design, or at least reevaluate the entire design to make sure your design is on track and your objectives are true. So once you've done all that, and as I said, preferably a few iterations of it, now you have a great design settled on, bought into, not just by the business owner, but by everyone in the whole organization. And now the goal for execution. Not for anybody who's a very well-seasoned practitioner of UX, Don Norman's gap between stimulus and understanding, but what I've nicknamed the difference between what you give to the development team and what comes out the other end, as shown here. That suggestion box is not the way I designed it, which is an entire other topic, so I'll talk about next month. But now I see that there are several other questions, so let me go ahead and get through some of those things for everybody. Timing is an excellent one, and again, something I possibly should have put in here, because I've answered that on other slides when I talk about working. Actually, I may even talk about it next month. I'll try to remember to put that slide in there. How to integrate your process with the design, with the project timelines, with development schedules, and so forth, is another one, much like when I discussed the difficulty, speed, expense, and complexity of research. It can seem like it takes forever to do good user experience design. And I'll agree that ideally you do take a couple months to evaluate many of these processes. But there are a couple ways to essentially cheat at it. I'd use less loaded terms, but I don't know any, so that's what it is. One is if you're integrated well with the whole process, you can often do a relatively quick and dirty design for the first round, especially if you're doing some iterative launch process. And after 5 weeks of development, something is done and heavily clicked through, but it isn't yet out to the public. So you can integrate in with whatever iterative development process is going on if that's open to you. The key one that usually comes up for me, though, is if you're engaged with the project early enough, or if you're able to be engaged with the project early enough. If you're an internal team and you can see the upcoming projects on some IT watch list, there are months and months before something goes from glimmer in somebody's eye to actually being on a development schedule. You can do your work in that time frame to help them to do many of these objectives where you do things like interview and create the vision statements and so forth as a part of that first step to help the organization decide what the project was really about. Not only do you get the chance to do your evaluative processes and start your design, which, if anybody's worried, you can just call a concept design, even though you're actually working on the real project. But often you'll be greeted with great appreciation by the marketing or business owners or whoever, because they don't necessarily like writing up business requirements or vision statements and so forth. So since you want to do it, they'll let you. They'll love it. Now, a more complex question I was asked is, what methods are there to to adjust the UI to many screen sizes available? This is almost it almost entirely is addressed by an entirely other presentation I've given before, which you can also go look up. It's out on SlideShare. In the past, I've had more complex answers around not being screen-centric, not being pixel-centric. Don't use fireworks, but use anything vector-based. Use design specifications instead of screenshots, and let things be fluid and open and designed by classes and so forth. Of late, I have kind of an extension of this, which kind of think of it as even my closing slide buzzword here, of design for every screen, where you take the same principles here of having principles of your design, and you perform information architecture studies and so forth without a particular screen size, platform, or anything else in mind at first. You build a blueprint, for example, version of the information architecture that's true for everyone, and then at least the first iteration, but you may go through a few of these, you reapply those constraints and start and branch that basic design into multiple information architectures for each and every type of device you're working on. So although, for example, OS-specific things on handsets need to be applied well, you can't use iOS menu styles on an Android device without confusing the hell out of people and frustrating them and getting very poor sales. You don't need to change the whole architecture. You don't need to have a separate iOS and Android development team and go to that kind of inefficiency. You can do one design, one architecture, one data structure, and so forth, and then branch it as late, essentially, in the process late in the design process as possible in order to address the specifics of each platform. And I'm looking. And I got another question about native or web, but yes, the book covers everything, including devices, a little bit on kiosks, a little bit of background on OS-level information that you may find hard to change, like how do virtual keyboards work, because oftentimes they are changeable, or at least you need to know what the constraints are when you're building your application, and so forth. And I think, well, now, unless I've missed one, I seem to have answered all the questions, so we can wait around a minute, see if anybody else is about to type one.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Folks, you heard Stephen. We are wrapping up. If you do have a final question for him or have questions about what he talked about today, please type those into the group chat so we can make sure he answers it. And yes, we just got one. Amit asks, what are the best wireframing tools and techniques for mobile apps?
That's another one that I can talk on and on and on and on about for hours. So much so that, one of the things in the appendix of the book, which I update all the time, it's out on the website that supports the book as well, which is on that slide. If you zoom in, you'll see the address, I think. Yeah, on the forth.com, it links to it. That I gathered up every possible tool and template and so forth. So if it's out there, you can try it, and they're great ideas. I like leaving my designers the ability to draw new solutions. So I see the value and occasionally use prototyping type tools, but most of the ones I've used tend to constrain you to, or they make it too difficult to add new widgets, new design ideas and so forth. And so I try to use more drawing tool-centric ones. Right now, I tend to be using InDesign. And if you haven't heard of anybody using that, it's actually weirdly popular, just nobody talks about it. 8Shapes is probably the only place that does publish their stuff aside from me, but a lot of people I work with actually are using InDesign secretly in the back office there. Two things I like about it then. One is that it can be used almost like a lightweight Illustrator. It only misses a few features. So it's basically a drawing tool, and you can draw whatever you want or import whatever you want. The other thing is that it's not just about drawing. The other reason I like it, more to the point, is that you're not just making wireframes, but you need to be creating design specifications. And so tools like InDesign work with typography very well. It's easy to type long paragraphs and do bullet lists and so forth, which you must do because you need to explain what the design is, how it works, and it's in even prototypes, even code samples, so forth, can only go so far because you have to click through every state to see them. So you really need to have a specification that explains rules for displaying information, timings numerically, for example, how long it takes to transition or how long you hover before something appears, to development organizations so that they know what's going on and why.
Great. All right, Stephen, we do have a couple more questions that just came in. We do still have a few minutes, so folks, here we go. All right, question says, for small teams with limited resources, what is your opinion about responsive design?
I got to make sure I got the buzzword correctly. Let me think. I'm trying to write. So this is one of those where I would normally make you stand up in the room and say what you think responsive design is, because I get a lot of these where there are multiple opinions on things. So I think it's a little similar to my previous one about my previous answer about designing for multiple screen sizes and platforms and so forth. But in more detail, and I hope I'm answering it right. This is one of those where being not in the room, watching you scowl or nod your head, it's hard to get their feedback. So I hope I'm answering it right. I also almost have problems answering this because I've essentially been doing something like it, and I know a lot of people who've been doing it for years in ways that are kind of weird. One of the newest trends, for example, is to use HTML5 and wrap your website in a little application wrapper and use that as your app. And there are people who even oppose that as, oh, but what if it changes? Anyway, that has actually been going on secretly with custom tagging implementations and so forth for years. So I've actually worked on this. I've done it for probably 5 or 6 years now. I've been building products that were both desktop and mobile web, and then a version of it that is built in a wrapper for the application layer. I think it's a great, great thing. I think it's hugely efficient, and not just for building, but one of the biggest problems you run into for a lot of these types of products is that nobody wants to refresh them or improve them. they throw them away and start over, and you lose a lot of institutional knowledge. You'll lose a lot of capabilities when you do upgrades, because they'll add the new cool feature but maybe lose another one. So anything you can do to make stuff more efficient is great. A way to approach the process, I still go with my design for every screen mode, and I think it fits even better because the branching can happen ridiculously late, even at the code level, even at the implementation level. You're building one basic structure for everybody, and then you cut out certain features, say, that are not illegal or not, up to your business practices. You change which landing page people start on, and then you just change things like certain interactions, like I said earlier, OS level, menu structure specifics, and so forth, or typography, or how the thing is multi-column on a tablet and a single row with a pull-down strip on the top when it's on the handset size thing. Those are all can be the same basic code, same code base, and of course, the same architecture and much broadly the same interaction. So I think it's great and almost a natural thing, but I'm glad it's kind of coming out as a buzzword feature. Google. I'm looking at some of the questions now. You pushed them to me. There's so many products from Google, I often forget. Google Wave was the collab. Somebody asked if it was a viable tool for collaborative design tasks. I believe that is one that I used once. The biggest problem with any collaborative tool is getting everybody to use it. That's worked. That's been true of every place I've ever worked, whether it's a formal, somewhat ad hoc development wiki or a formal Microsoft-built sharing tool, or we'll all just agree to check the 37 Signals Backpack or Basecamp site, or one of the Google sharing products, or anything. They need to have notification methods, is what the main thing I'll say. You need to be able to bug people directly so that they basically go back to the principles of good workflow management. And if they're not told they have a task, or that they become late on a task, or everybody's waiting on them, then they won't. You can't assume people will go check, because you don't have the stickiness, the addictiveness of being Facebook built into your product. So you need to make sure that's true. There are some pretty cool things coming out lately. I've been using Google Plus has interesting integration with Google Documents. So you can make comments and write a plus and a username in the comment, and they'll get notified of the comment. So that's a nice way to leverage notifications of sort of social network, almost notification levels for document sharing. A difficult one for me. What techniques did you use as a developer to get good at UX design? So I was never truly a developer, because if I had more time, I'd tell you how bad I am, how I never was able to compile a piece of software when I was back in college. So I don't go past coding and algorithmic design and so forth. But I've employed developers on mixed teams, or actually on teams where they specifically wanted to move from being a software developer to a presentation developer to a designer. There's a little bit of something where we're not in a totally egalitarian society, and people are good, better, and worse at certain things. But a lot more people are good at design than admit they are, and good developers tend to be designers already. They're just designing software. And oftentimes, even if they're not going to move into being UX designers or anything, simply engaging with your developers and encouraging them to really design solutions with you is a great first step. Or, of course, if you're that way yourself, again, don't just use rote solutions or reuse stuff that you already made. Think about what the best solution could be. And even from a technical point of view, then you start thinking about applying yourself that much better. And then you can move in. Then it's quite easy to move into applying next principles. You can insist on working with your UX people in the way that we just outlined today, and don't just take the documents, but start asking nicely, why did you do this? If they seem challenged by it and are annoyed that they have to defend themselves, explain the reasoning. No, I want to know why so that I apply it correctly. you'll start picking up the reasoning behind the designs, or find out they're terrible designers. You can pick up the reasons behind this stuff. You can go look it up. I find Google to be perhaps the best tool for understanding design ever, because you pick up buzzwords as they're discussed. You find out that, this thing is a principle. It isn't something they made up. They're referring to an existing principle of this, and therefore now that I use their buzzword in the document, I read about it and I understand it better. It's easier than you'd think, I think, to move that way. Move from development to understanding design. Okay, and we only have a few minutes left. I see a repost of the what time apply the guidelines and what time frames. So I'll just do the summary version of that. You can do it in ridiculously short times if needed. I've done broadly this kind of process, without the iterations, of course, in as little as about a week. It's fairly easy to sit down with a couple of important people on the team and ask them questions and write out design objectives and do evaluations and so forth. And even with only one or two designers, get the basic framework in so that it helps guide as you complete the design and marshal it through the implementation stage. But ideally, you use built-in delays in the organization to the time between the glimmer in somebody's eye and the time it actually goes to development. And you repurpose existing tasks like the creation of business objectives and vision statements and epics, depending on what kind of process you're in. And you either do those yourself or you become deeply involved in them in order to carry out the tasks that you want to get done while also helping the whole organization. You look helpful while also kind of cheating and getting ahead of things on the design. And I think that is all of it, and we're also at about a minute till the time, so I assume you'll cut me off soon anyway.
Perfect, Stephen. This just went fantastic, and we'd like to say a very big thank you to you for your wonderful and informative presentation. We thank everyone that attended the webcast, everyone who sent in questions. Stephen got so many good questions, folks. Thank you so much. Having those questions really adds just that much more to these webcasts, and we thank you all. We'd like to remind you that Stephen is presenting another webcast with O'Reilly on February 29th, and we posted the URL in the group chat, so you can register for that. Our webcasts are free, and as you can see, you can really learn a lot. Also, for everyone attending today, we'd like to let you know Stephen's book is O'Reilly's Deal of the Day. Visit O'Reilly.com. On the right-hand side, you will see it. Click on it, and you can save 50%. Thank you again, Stephen. Thank you, everyone. This will conclude today's webcast. Goodbye, everyone.